He is a leading chartered accountant in South Africa, the CEO of one of the largest chartered accountancy companies in our country, next year SAB&T. Spent a large part of his life in the auditing and accounting profession, serves on the International Board of Nexia, which is one of the world's largest network of chartered accountants. He's a very keen student of economics and figures and how it affects people. And he has a passion to dissect economic information, particularly for the common person. I had the privilege of watching him and listening to him for the first time 2 weeks ago, when he gave an absolutely brilliant overview of the budget that was revealed in Parliament a few weeks ago, and his ability to be able to put it across in an absolutely no-nonsense way so that it makes a lot of sense to the common people. Before I call upon him, the topic that we have asked him to speak on is South Africa today, the economic outlook and the future landscape. In my opinion, there are 6 things which people need in this world. Then you don't care who governs you. The one is your freedom. The second one is security. The third one is employment. The fourth one is education. The fifth one is a roof above your head. And the last one is your health and your well-being. And all this is all linked to the economy of the country. Therefore, to speak to us on this topic, South Africa today, the economic outlook and the future landscape, gives me immense pleasure to call upon Basheer Adam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So Darba, I listened to you and I asked myself, do I really deserve the accolades? And I don't think so. But I think the one thing that we all faced with is what is currently happening in South Africa. Now, to put that into context, in 1994, probably a month after I started practice, I had an opportunity to move to the States. Los Angeles, for those of you that are big, bold and beautiful fans, the firm was in Wilshire Boulevard and everything that was nice about it. And after thinking about it for about 2 hours, I said, no. We've got a role to play in South Africa. We're going to make a difference. We just found our freedom. That's what we're going to do, and that's where I'm going to stay. 29 years later, I asked myself, was that the right decision that I made way back when? However, when we think about where we are, where the country is, I think to myself, Western Cape, well, you guys are not that bad. I mean, I was here 2 weeks ago, I got here yesterday. I'm still looking for my first pothole. I haven't found a pothole in Cape Town yet, so it's not as bad as everywhere else. But for us to talk about the economic outlook of the country, I think one needs to take account of everything else that has been said and has been contextualized over the course of the last few weeks. Now, if we think about it, where does our year start? The first week of February, the president comes out and he talks about SONA. A few weeks after that, by and large, the financial or the Minister of Finance comes out and he talks about the budget speech and he lays what we've achieved or what we haven't achieved. And sometimes they make what we haven't achieved look like what we have achieved, right? So that's a bit of the spin doctoring and all of those things that come through. But we come through with all of those things, and by and large, when we look at it, we say, well, it doesn't look too bad. Now, the question is not so much what is being said to you, but what's not being said. What's between the lines? What is the stuff that the person, the layman, not the economist, not the accountant, not the judge, not the political analyst, the layman doesn't get to see in the budget? In other words, it's not in black and white, but if you analyze it and you go in between, that's where all of those things are. So as a start and as the basis for today's discussion, we're going to talk about this year's budget, the context of this budget, what this budget means going forward, and what the implications was of where this budget was this year. Now, if we think the Honourable Minister of Finance came out and the first thing he said was the economic outlook of the country was that we achieved a 2.5% growth rate this year. That was the first thing. We achieved a 2.5% growth rate this year. And everyone says, yeah, because we didn't expect to achieve a 2.5% growth rate a year ago. So that's a great thing. And we've achieved something fantastic about it. But in the very next sentence, he says, we achieved a growth rate of 2.5 and we expect to achieve 1.4% growth over the next 3 years. Now you look at that in the big context of things, it's not all that bad. There's growth. Russia's in recession. We know why they're in recession. They're at war with Ukraine. The UK is in recession because they don't know if they want to be in the European Union or they don't want to be in the European Union. That's where the UK is. America, for some or other reason, is just full steam ahead. That economy just keeps going and going and going, despite what everyone thinks, and that fuels inflation. And we now see China coming out of its slumber. And what's that going to mean in terms of where we are? So when we look at the 2.1% or the 2.5% coupled with the 1.4% going forward, we say that's not all too bad. But where do we go from there? The next sentence that he says is the economic outlook faces a range of risks. Now, you just told us how great we've done. Now you're preparing us. You're already preparing us for what we're not going to do. So you're telling us this is what's going to happen, right? Provided that that and that and that and that doesn't happen. Why do we say those things as politicians? Because next year when we don't achieve 1.4%, what do we say? But we told you last year there was a risk of A, B, C, and D, right? So all of those things are what's there. Now, what were those risks, if we think about it? Further disruptions to global supply with the war in Ukraine and Russia. Guess what? That war is not going to end in the next year. It's not going to end in the next few weeks. So that risk will come real. That risk will become a reality. Continued power cuts. Anyone guess, are we going to stop getting power cuts anytime in the next year? No. So continued power cuts is going to impact the growth of South Africa. Deterioration in the ports and rail infrastructure. I was reading the other day, after how long did the one rail, the main line start again in Cape Town? After 5 years? 3 years? After 3 years. So everything, including our public transport, is falling down. It's taking us years to get things back up. I looked at a graph this morning that said the Transnet output in terms of tonnage that is sent out over the course of the last 5 years has fallen by 50%, right, in terms of what we're sending out. So those are the kind of things that poses a risk to us. Then the next one, I mean, come on, think about it. The minister says, widespread criminal activity. I'm not an economist, and I'm certainly not a minister, and I'm certainly not a politician, but logic tells me that if we've got widespread criminal activity and corruption, that there will be an issue in growth, right? So those are the other things that's there. And then it says, government is taking urgent measures to address all of these things. Okay, there's a shining light. Government is taking urgent measures to address all of these things. But I went and I sat back a little bit and I said, okay, let's just think about all the things that the minister says and how this then impacts us going forward. And what it came down to was, I looked at the context and I said, okay, so how did we achieve 2.5% growth? How did we actually get to 2.5% growth? One, SARS was extra efficient, to the point that they were aggressive. Right? So SARS and what they refer to as enhanced tax administration. So here's a tip for you businessmen out there. The first tip for the afternoon. Part of SARS being enhancing their tax administration is digging out the dormant company that you had lying dormant for the last 15 years and not submitting tax returns, and charging you administration penalties for not submitting tax returns for the last 15 years. So that's how SARS is becoming more efficient. They're finding the stuff that we're not doing because no one asked for it for the last 15 years. Why should we have done it? Now they're saying, but you should have done it because that's what the Tax Administration Act says. So they say one thing, they practice one thing, and then when it suits them, they implement something else. Right? Same thing with provisional taxpayers. They changed the definition, never implemented it, and this year started penalizing everybody for not submitting their returns on time. So that was the first thing. SARS was great in terms of what they did. But if we look into all of this, we've got rising debt in the country. So the amount of debt in the country has grown by 100%. We've doubled the amount of debt in the country since 2018. Now, if we put that into context, with debt, higher debt comes higher cost of borrowing. What comes with higher cost of borrowing, or currently, we spend in South Africa 1 billion rand a day on interest that you and I pay. So 20% of every rand that we pay in tax goes to service the debt of the country. Now that's not my estimate, that's a fact. We pay 1 billion rand a day in interest. Right? I'm going to talk a little bit later about a fragile tax base. We've got a very fragile tax base. We've got a very narrow tax base, and I'll point out why I say we're a fragile tax base. The problem is, if that tax base cracks, we don't have the support to implement anything that needs to be supported. I've already touched on the Ukraine war. Infrastructure challenges. Our ports are standing still. Our rail is standing still. We all know what's happening with Eskom. So we don't have power. So that's just the way things are going to happen. And what do we happen in South Africa? When all of these things happen, we appoint a commission or a committee or a task team or something that puts a lot of people in the room to have lunch and talk a lot of long stories and write a thick report with no action at the end of the day. Right or wrong? That's what happens. That's where we put the efforts in instead of getting things done. But more than all of that, we've developed a culture in South Africa, one of non-payment. Right? So we've got a culture of non-payment. We've got a culture of lack of accountability. We have a culture of ill discipline because we don't enforce and we don't implement. And we have one of procrastination. Right? Why do today what can be done tomorrow or next year and in 2 years' time? So unfortunately, that's the reality of where we are. Now, if we look at that context against the backdrop of unemployment levels amongst youth hovering in excess of 50%, right? What does that make you think about? The Arab Spring. Think about it. The youth not being employed, the youth not being able to work, the youth not being able to put bread on the table. What happens? Right? It bubbles underneath until one day it explodes. Right? That's the Arab Spring. So I don't think we're too far away from the African Spring, but my learned colleagues in the political scenario can talk a little bit more about that. Other than SARS, that's the state-owned entity, the one state-owned entity that's actually performing to the point that it's breaking its target market, it's breaking its records, it's breaking the taxpayers, it's enforcing at every level. But at some point you reach a level where the productive actions of SARS is actually unproductive to what comes in, because taxpayers just can't give anymore at some point. Right? And I'll put that into context just now. Our education system need an overhaul completely. We put that into context. 2 surveys recently, the Pearls and the TIM surveys, and South Africa ends last in numeracy and literacy. Something we need to think about. Why is it that we're ending last on all of these things? I've already mentioned state-owned enterprises, but Eskom's not the only one that's dead. The ports and Transnet and the Rail Freight Association are not the only ones that's dead. Praza is just about dead. The post office is dying a very slow death and a very painful death, right? But the post office is, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt and dead. Water and sanitation. One of the things that came out in the budget, we've spoken about water and sanitation, what is going on there, and it's not going well. And that list goes on. I can stand here all day and we can pick every one and go through every one of them, but all of them have issues. And that, unfortunately, is the reality. Then the one that breaks the camel's back, crime. How do we deal with crime? All right? That's the one that we can't accept as people, because if you don't have security in the sanctity of your home, or in the masjids that we frequent, or in your place of work, then what do we have? If we don't have any of those things, then what do we have? And that is the one that puts the most risk on the country and the security of its people. Because if we're not safe in where we live and where we work, how can we be productive? Right? So these are the types of things that we need to think about. So some of the solutions, now, everyone's picked up the issues. All right? These were the issues. But government also said we had some solutions. National Treasury will encourage and improve the culture of non-payment. I think, just step back and think of, National Treasury is going to drive the behavioral change of non-payment. That's not National Treasury's job. That's the job of government. That should be taken on by the president. The president should be walking that road. He should be implementing, putting in the necessary steps in place to make that happen. But National Treasury is not going to do it. Government will take on 254 billion. That is more than 50% of Eskom's debt. Now, this is interesting, right? Because when they take over 254 billion, and you're going to look at the projected debt over the next 3 years, what would you expect to happen? If government debts, assuming that it stands constant, and we add Eskom's debt to that, you'd assume that the debt would increase by 254 billion, correct? Because we're taking 254 billion of Eskom's debt. If you're going to look at the numbers they project, debt in the next 3 years will climb by 1 trillion rand. So we're taking on 254 billion in revenue, and our debt is climbing by 1 trillion. How does that make sense? So here's the answer. We are borrowing money, not to build infrastructure, etc., that can produce and stimulate and be productive in the economy. We are borrowing money to consume. That's what we're doing. Now, those of you in business, those of you with a business mind, we've always been taught long-term debt finances assets, short-term debt finances the short-term assets, right? The working capital. We are borrowing long-term debt to fund our spending on a daily basis. Now that's a big, big problem. But more importantly than that is that Eskom are only going to get the 254 billion bailout on two conditions. On two conditions. One is that they must concession out all their power stations. That's the first one. The second one is that, like everything else, we will appoint a consortium to advise them on what to do. So remember what I said about commission, state, task force, committee. Now we're appointing a consortium to tell them what to do. But the important one on that one is the fact that from an Eskom perspective, the fact that they must concession out their power stations to the private sector is a fundamental shift in policy from the ANC. Remember? Nationalization, we will never privatize state assets. That's the policy state. But what are we doing if we're saying you must concession out? We're privatizing the operations of Eskom. That's what we're doing. So, from a policy perspective, we can't say that there's a policy shift from nationalization to privatization, but now we can subtly go and start privatizing bits and pieces of state assets. That's exactly what's happening. Right. So if we look at all of that, that's Eskom and its state debt. We're going to encourage taxpayers to invest in energy generation through tax incentives. So we give you and I and our businesses tax incentives to put in solar panels, to renew the, to put in renewable energy projects, and we'll get a tax deduction for all of those things. Then, from an electricity perspective, that was the highlight of the President Sona speech. We are going to appoint the Minister of Electricity. I said, okay, that's interesting. I mean, let's face it, it's an absolute gem. So now who controls Eskom? The Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, the Minister of Energy and Minerals and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, or the Minister of Electricity? Who controls it? Guess what? Who controls it? Nobody. Because when there's too many people and no one takes accountability, nothing happens. If nobody takes accountability, nothing happens. And that's exactly what's going to happen as we stand. Now, let's put that into context. Our Minister of Electricity came in, first thing he said was, I'm going to visit all the power stations and do an assessment. Second thing he says was, within a year or two, load shedding will be something of the past. Third thing he said was, we will never exceed stage 6 load shedding. 3 days ago he said, we should be preparing for stage 10 load shedding. Okay, so now when you listen to someone like that, it doesn't give you a whole lot of confidence, right? Because things just go up and down, and that's the way it works. So that's something we've got to worry about. We're going to take the diesel refund that we give people, we're going to help them in the food manufacturing stuff. We're going to put diesel refunds back into people to lessen the impact of fuel. And we're going to give money to address crime, right? So we're going to give money to the police to recruit 15,000 or 10,000 trainees. Now, you should shiver when you ask yourself, who's going to train those trainees? Because if it's the very competent force that we have at the moment, then those trainees should be really well trained by the time they come out on the other side, right? So that's the first thing we need to look at. The second thing we need to look at is we're going to give the NPA 100 million rand, 100 million rand, to prosecute all the people implicated, or some of the people implicated, in the state capture as what came out from Judge Zondo. Right? Now, we spent R1 billion or 2 billion rand on the Zondo Commission, taxpayers' money. 1 billion. Thank you, Judge. 1 billion rand we spent, but we're going to spend 100 million rand to prosecute the people on it. Now, doesn't make sense. Right? That we're going to spend 100 million rand to actually do justice. But again, what does that say? That says we put something in, we hope to hit, and at some point we even expect an outcome, but we don't put in the proper resources. So that's the kind of stuff that we need to think about in terms of where we're going and what we're going to achieve. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at where we are in terms of growth, Sub-Saharan Africa is poised to grow at an average of 4% over the next 3 years. Right? The world is poised to grow at around 3% over the next 3 years. South Africa, according to National Treasury and their budget, says we're going to grow by 1.4% over the next 3 years. The Reserve Bank, who are much better at forecasting than what National Treasury is, has just revised the growth down to 0.2%. Right? So who do you believe? Anyone? Nobody. Right? Play neutral, stay safe, and say we're not going to experience growth for the next 3 years. Because what's happening? The Ukraine war is not going to end. Load shedding is not going to end. So all the risks that were pointed out is not going to end. So we shouldn't be surprised if we don't achieve anything in the next few years. From a debt perspective, in 2021, we were supposed to have bridged debt at 71% of GDP. We didn't do it. We now put the peak in 2025-26 that we're going to peak at 73% of GDP. Right? That's not going to happen either. But it does demonstrate the culture we have of procrastinating. We can't make a call and stick by it. And what happens as that goes up, the borrowing costs go up more than anything else. So, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, when you decide on the future in terms of where you are, let me leave two more facts with you to put into context just how fragile we are. In South Africa, corporate taxes contribute some 18% to revenue. That's company tax. A total of 770 companies, not 770,000, 770. Not 7,700, 770, as in 770. Pay 60% of all corporate tax. Now, what happens if those companies, or any amount of those companies, are taken over by foreigners, are closed down, don't meet demand, don't meet their profit targets, etc., etc.? Think about the impact on our tax revenue. What is more scary than that? Doesn't quite work that way, Judge. What is more scary than that is that from an individual perspective, the single biggest contributor to tax in South Africa, so we as individuals pay approximately 37% of all revenue comes from individuals. So let me give you a breakdown of that. South Africa has 14.5 million registered taxpayers, individuals, 14.5 million. 7.5 million of those don't pay tax because they're under the threshold, they earn less than the threshold, so they don't pay any tax. They're poor. Yeah, they're poor. That's what it comes down to. So they don't pay tax, right? Then we have the top end, where 160,000 people pay tax at the maximum marginal rate. So 160,000 people earn above 1.5 million rand in South Africa, and they pay tax at the maximum marginal rate. Now that's 160,000 people, and the total tax that they contribute to the country is 30% of all personal income tax. 160,000 people. Not 1.6 million, 160,000 people. The scary part about those 160,000 people is those are also the 160,000 people that pay the most VAT in terms of the goods they purchase. Those are also the 160,000 people that pay the most fuel taxes because they're the people that own the cars and can fill up tanks, etc., etc., etc. But what would happen if we lost 10% or 15% or 20% of those 160,000 people? Because those 160,000 people are also the 160,000 people that are able to immigrate and migrate to other countries around the world because they've got the capital, the know-how, the assets, etc., etc., to be welcomed into other countries. How do we deal with that? Right? Those are the people that are not here. Now, Satarbai sent me an article yesterday about one of the real captains of industry, speaking about the potential and the hope and everything else in South Africa. And Satarbai, you'd have noticed that I did send you a message, but I deleted it afterwards. Right? Because while I agree with all of those captains of industry that say how great South Africa is and how much potential it is, and how they are committed to the long-term growth, etc., of South Africa, most of those captains of industry have all their wealth and their families and everything else outside of South Africa. That, unfortunately, is the harsh reality of it, irrespective of what it is that they say. Finally, the one thing and I mentioned the advent of the African Spring, and I also mentioned the growth in debt over the next few years. One of the reasons feeding the growth in debt is that we started something during the pandemic that we can't reverse. And that's, we've increased the grants to the COVID-19 grant. So we've now got grants. We paid 27 million people receive grants in South Africa on a monthly basis. The reality is, how is it possible to reverse a grant once you've given? My opinion is no, that it's not, without causing severe destruction and unhappiness with the people and the recipients of those grants. So that's something we need to think about. Government has recognized that we need to think about how we replace the grant. Don't replace the grant. If you're spending something, you're spending something. Call it whatever else you want to call it, you're still spending it. So we can't really do away with that grant. It becomes a permanent fixture in terms of where we are. Brothers and sisters, in conclusion, I think everything is not always as it seems. And sometimes we need to look a little bit deeper in terms of the decisions that we make in our lives. Have we hit the precipice from a South African perspective? In my opinion, yes, we have. Can we pull it back? Absolutely, because that's who we are. That's what we are. We're resilient. We do things. Siddhartha, you said something about the Muslim community. I think it is immeasurable how much we have contributed towards the South African economy. But it's the communities like us that are going to be needed to pull it back. Government is not going to do it. Jazakallah for listening.